The answer is because we think that we're separate. Even though the recent events that have been happening on a global level recently have been consistently showing us that we are nothing but separate, that we are actually one, we're still very reluctant to recognize this fact that we're not separate at all. Just take this recent virus happening in China and spreading across the world, and people dying in France and people dying in Ukraine and other countries in Europe. And I dare say that I feel this might spread beyond the scope of the continent. Why is this happening? This is happening just because we are ignorant to recognize that we just cannot separate ourselves. We just cannot build a wall and think as if that wall will be sufficient to actually create a sense of safety. How about those bombing attacks? How about Australia and people from all over the world gathering funds to help animals survive in Australia, help people survive in Australia? How about the Amazon? How about that massive damage that the fires have done to the rainforest, the lungs of the planet? Excuse me for the cliche. Why is this happening? On an esoteric level, and I've been studying esoterics for a very long time, and I'm by no means insisting that I'm somehow woke or super enlightened or anything. I'm just sharing my perspective as a human being based on the direct experiences that I've had with reality. I think that whatever is happening to nudge us into a certain direction. And what is happening with all those natural catastrophes, with all those disasters, tragic disasters around the world, is nudging us into the understanding that we cannot remain separate from each other any longer. When we grow up, we go through a stage of individuation. We start perceiving ourselves as a separate creature, separate from the external world. And that's how we predominantly view ourselves. We think that there is me, a perceiver, like a little man inside or a little woman inside, or whatever it is. And this internal perceiver is looking at the external world that is happening outside. And that is how we think about reality. We think that there is me and there are other people. We think that there are sentient creatures and we think there are non-sentient creatures like rocks and minerals or the soil or anything. But in fact, we can no longer ignore this truth of oneness, because if we dare look deep inside ourselves, we will discover that we're one. And that is something that mystics have been talking about for a very long time. It involves a deep study of non-duality, and I don't really want to go into that territory today. But there is one very important thing I'd really love to mention. If we want to use this suffering to recognize something that we haven't been able to see before, we need to get into the perspective of being ready to learn. We need to stop being so dogmatic and assuming we know everything about reality and how it works, because all we know is locked into this materialistic paradigm. And just to see our ignorance and open up to alternative paradigms, if we are able to do that, I'm very sure we'll be able to come up with alternative solutions, because the current issues that the planet is presenting us to these days, those issues just cannot be approached from the conventional paradigm. We need to recognize that wherever we're living in is just a paradigm and that it can be shifted. And from personal experience, I'm very happy to share with you the fact that it can be shifted into a paradigm where we ourselves feel much happier. And when we start living from that perspective, everything will look brighter and intelligent as it is. Suffering has a role. It calls us into realizing something. It just tells us, please shed the light of consciousness on this thing and actually recognize what you have not been wanting to recognize prior to that. That's what suffering is doing. That's what big role it's serving these days. And recognizing that separation is something that only conceptually exists, is something that does not exist in reality. Realizing that, awakening to that fact, is really, really great, because it will help reduce the suffering if we're able to embrace that new perspective. It cannot just come from reading a book or watching a YouTube video. That is actually something that has to be experienced. That's why it's so powerful. If we experience non-duality, if we experience unity and oneness, if we experience that direct consciousness that permeates every single being, be it what we might call a sentient being or a non-sentient being, if we recognize that this consciousness makes part of every single one of us, and this consciousness is one, and there is no such thing as an internal world versus an external world. If we actually spend more time trying to seriously grasp those existential truths, I'm very much convinced we'll be able to make a step towards a more inclusive society. To end this video with practical tips, here are some practical things that you can do to start working with your own consciousness, to expand your own sense of being, of what you are personally, which will create a step towards a deeper transformation. And at the end, it will take you to recognizing the truth of all human beings being and what the universal consciousness really is. Here are some things that you can take to reduce the suffering in the world, and I'm being completely serious. If you want to do that, make sure you follow this path, because it really works. The first thing that you're going to do is try and eliminate the judgment you have of other people. Notice how much judgment we hold about others and ourselves. When we walk along the street, what do? We just judge. What we do is we look at a thing, we look at an object, and we relate it to our sense of self. Do I like it? Do I not like it? That's basically the thing that we do. We try to see how everything in our external reality relates to our sense of self, whether we like it or not. That's what we do. Notice how you actually do this, whatever paradigm you come from. You don't have to take up a spiritual paradigm, or you don't have to take on a religious paradigm to start doing that if you identify with being very scientific. That's a very scientific thing. That's the most scientific thing that you can do. Just adopt that empirical perspective, experiment and see how everything that you do, everything that you say in your mind back to yourself in your internal voice is basically a judgment of how the things around you relate to your sense of yourself. See how you react from that perspective, how you react from that core. How does it make you react? One great exercise that I really advise people do is when they're in public transport, you can just look around and ask yourself, looking at every person, what 3 things do I have in common with this person? For instance, I might be on a bus and I might be looking at the bus driver who looks very rude. In Ukraine, bus drivers are quite rude, I have to tell you that. You might look at that person and think, oh, okay, so we're both people. We both worry about our income, because here in Ukraine in particular, bus drivers try to maximize their income just like nobody else. They really, really try very, very hard, because probably they have experienced an unprivileged background. So maybe that is something you have experienced as well, so you can relate to that person. Talking about your own experiential background of poverty or being underprivileged in a certain way. That would have to be the third thing. Another practical exercise that I would recommend is generally opening up to accepting everything and everyone, every single dimension of life, every single outlook of life as yourself. Teaching ourselves to love equals teaching ourselves to expand our sense of identity and taking everything around us as ourselves. That's an incredible practice. Challenging yourself is a very practical thing to do, and also a very enjoyable thing to do, because when we challenge ourselves to step out of our comfort zone, we evolve, and that's the natural drive that we have within us. We love evolving, we love learning, we love discovering. Walking along the street or getting to your office might be a great practice, because on your way you will meet people who you might actually be very much inclined to turn away from, like an old drunk person, a beggar, right? So those would have to be the people that we criticize a lot. We just say, why doesn't he get a job? Why wouldn't she feel empowered? Why wouldn't he listen to some YouTube video when he has a chance to? Why doesn't she evolve? That's what we do. So looking at that person and actually telling myself, that's me, I include that person as part of myself, is a really great practice, because when you take someone or something as part of yourself, you can no longer hurt that person. You cannot damage that thing, because that would be equal to damaging yourself, hurting yourself. Are you getting the logic behind it? If I'm looking at my hand and I'm thinking, oh, this is part of myself, am I likely to hurt my hand? Am I likely to cut off my finger just because I'm willing to, on a whim? I don't think so. I don't think so. The sense of identity that we hold is a highly conceptual formation, and we can get beyond that formation by recognizing that we have the power to construct our sense of identity. We can have the power to create it in the way that we want. The final thing that I'm going to recommend doing here to reduce suffering in the world on a global level is actually learning to create the space within yourself for holding opposing opinions and not reacting to them, not starting to defend, not rushing to protect your own opinion when you're confronted with a person who has a different opinion that is different from your own. Isn't that incredible? Imagine how easy it would become to live if you could go to any debate occasion, if you could go to any YouTube channel and watch the person talking about their opinion, expressing their opinion, and you not immediately jumping into the judgment mode, trying to see whether you agree or disagree with that person. Wouldn't that be a liberation? Think about it. Try pretending that you can act out that way. That would be incredible. To end this video with practical third-party recommendations, I would really love to send you to one of my favorite YouTube channels, actualize.org, and watch the video which is called The Brutality of Love, or The Brutal Nature of Love. I will include the link into the description box down below. Make sure you also go to the Amazon and purchase a copy of a book by Peter Ralston, which is called The Book of Not Knowing. This is a book of enlightenment and transformation, and also dismantling your current identity and realizing that you're not something that you think you are. And you might have heard this so many times before, and it's not enough just to hear about it and processing it intellectually. You need to actually grasp it existentially, practically, in your own life. If you can speak Russian, I'll be including a link down below where I talked about this whole notion of the role the suffering plays in our lives in an article that I published on a website called psi-practice.com, and I will include the link to that article in the description box down below if you would love to hear some extended opinion of mine on how we could view suffering alternatively. Don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe to my channel for more existential insights and learning insights, because I identify as a lifelong learner. That's something I like being, and I'll be waiting for you to make a comeback to my channel if you feel that the info and content here is reliable and something that inspires you to grow. Thank you.